The Face of Jesus the Nazarene, Part 2. Why did Rome tolerate the Jesus movement? Until Paul. For nearly 2,000 years, readers have noticed important differences between the recorded teachings of Jesus and many of the theological ideas that later came to define Christianity. Were those differences simply the natural development of a growing faith, or do they reflect two distinct streams of thought already present within first century Judaism? Jewish tradition remembers a time when Torah was interpreted in profoundly different ways. The House of Hillel emphasized compassion, reconciliation, and mercy. The House of Shammai became known for a stricter interpretation of the law. The Jerusalem Talmud even preserves the memory of a period when these differences became so significant that it spoke of two Torahs. Could that ancient observation help explain the earliest decades of the Jesus movement? By comparing the recorded teachings of Jesus with those of Paul, we'll ask which voice more closely reflects the compassionate tradition associated with Hillel and which more closely resembles the rigor remembered in the House of Shammai. We'll also consider whether those differing approaches help explain why Rome not only tolerated, but initially supported the movement surrounding Jesus before confronting a very different religious landscape a generation later. Long before Christianity emerged, Judaism was already engaged in an important conversation about how the Torah should be understood and lived. The two most influential schools were the House of Hillel and the House of Shammai. Both revered the same scriptures, both sought to honor God. Yet they often arrived at very different conclusions regarding law, mercy, justice, and human relationships. Jewish tradition remembers the intensity of these disagreements. We ask a simple historical question. When we compare the recorded teachings of Jesus and Paul, which interpretive tradition does each most closely resemble? We begin not with assumptions, but with the framework preserved by Jewish tradition itself. Again and again, the Gospels return to the same themes. Love your enemies, bless those who curse you, forgive without limit, care for the poor, welcome the stranger, feed the hungry, heal the sick, refuse retaliation, and judge not. When asked about the greatest commandment, Jesus answered with love for God, and love for one's neighbor. He summarized the law and the prophets in what has become known as the Golden Rule. Treat others as you would have them treat you. Whatever disagreements scholars may have about the details of his life, there is remarkable consistency in the ethical vision attributed to Jesus. Compassion was not merely one teaching among many. It was the lens through which he understood the Torah. As we continue, keep these teachings in mind as we compare them with another influential first-century voice and ask which path each one appears to follow. Before we attach names to either path, pause for a moment and consider the teachings we have just reviewed. Love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Forgive 70 times 7. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Blessed are the peacemakers. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Judge not, that you be not judged. These sayings are not isolated quotations. Together they form a consistent philosophy, a way of reading the Torah through the lens of compassion, reconciliation, and the dignity of every human being. Jewish tradition tells us that, during the generation before and after the life of Jesus, two great schools of interpretation shaped religious thought. One became associated with the House of Hillel, remembered for mercy, humility, and concern for one's neighbor. The other became associated with the House of Shammai, remembered for its stricter interpretation of the law. The ethical vision presented in the Gospels appears to align far more closely with the spirit traditionally associated with Hillel than with the rigor remembered in the House of Shammai. When we turn from the teachings of Jesus to the writings of Paul, do we encounter the same voice or a different understanding of the Torah? Now that we've explored the two principal interpretations of the Torah, let's look at another historical puzzle. The Jewish historian Josephus tells us that the Judaism of his day consisted of 4 philosophical movements. He names the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. Then he describes a 4th movement that arose at the time of the census under Quirinius. The same event Luke associates with the birth of Jesus. Yet unlike the other three, Josephus never gives this movement a name. He refers to it simply as the fourth philosophy. That omission is striking. Historians normally identify important movements by name. Why describe one in detail while leaving its identity unstated? Was the name obvious to his earliest readers? Was it deliberately omitted? Or does the answer lie elsewhere in the historical record? Before proposing a solution, we should ask a simple question. If the fourth philosophy had another name, where might we expect to find it? The next sources may offer an intriguing clue. For nearly 2,000 years, English readers have become accustomed to the expression Jesus of Nazareth. It sounds like a simple statement of hometown, much as we might say Paul of Tarsus. But the Greek text of the Gospels tells a more nuanced story. Again and again, Jesus is identified as Jesus the Nazarene. The definite article, the, gives the expression the character of a title or designation rather than simply an address. The Gospels also identify Jesus as coming from Nazareth, establishing his geographical association with the town. Yet the repeated designation, the Nazarene, is a distinct Greek expression, preserved consistently throughout the Gospel tradition. That raises an intriguing historical question. If Josephus describes a fourth philosophy but leaves it unnamed, while all four Gospels consistently preserve the designation, the Nazarene, could these independent traditions be pointing to the same movement? If the movement surrounding Jesus was known as the Nazarenes, what distinguished it from the other movements of first-century Judaism? The Gospels consistently portray Jesus calling people not to armed resistance, but to transformed relationships. He taught reconciliation over retaliation, service over status, forgiveness over revenge, and love even for one's enemies. He welcomed fishermen, laborers, tax collectors, women, children, and those society often overlooked. His kingdom was described not as a political revolution, but as a way of life expressed through compassion. That raises another historical question. If Roman authorities saw this movement primarily as a teacher gathering disciples and encouraging peaceful conduct, would they have viewed the Nazarenes as an immediate political threat? Or would they have welcomed a movement that encouraged peace among the Jews? Throughout the Gospels, Jesus teaches openly in villages, synagogues, and even the temple itself. The historical record suggests that Rome generally tolerated philosophical and religious movements unless they challenged imperial authority or disturbed public order. Even at the end of the story, the Gospels portray Pilate as reluctant to authorize Jesus' execution. Jesus was opposed, but not by Rome. Instead, the Gospels consistently portray conflicts with certain religious leaders over mercy, Sabbath observance, purity, forgiveness, and the proper interpretation of the Torah. These were not disputes over whether the Torah should be obeyed, but over how it should be understood. Could those controversies preserve the memory of a conflict between the compassionate tradition associated with Hillel and the stricter interpretation remembered in the House of Shammai? If the Nazarenes represented a distinct movement within first-century Judaism, another question naturally follows. Did they share beliefs or practices with any movement already known to history? Among those described by ancient writers, the Essenes stand out. Josephus, Philo, and Pliny portray them as a people devoted to simplicity, communal life, ritual purity, and peace. They lived apart from many of the religious and political struggles of their day and were widely admired for their discipline and integrity. Ancient sources also indicate that the Essenes stood apart from the temple's sacrificial system. Rather than emphasizing animal sacrifice, they stressed purity, prayer, righteous living, and obedience to God. The teachings attributed to Jesus reveal striking parallels. He challenged the commercial activities surrounding the temple. Throughout the Gospels, he consistently teaches that compassion takes precedence over ritual observance. These similarities raise an important historical question. Could the Nazarenes have emerged from the broader stream of thought represented by the Essenes, carrying their commitment to peace, purity and compassion from secluded communities into the villages and cities of Judea and Galilee? The parallels are substantial enough to deserve careful consideration before we turn to another influential voice who would profoundly shape the future of the Jesus movement. Our investigation has followed a consistent thread. We've examined the teachings of Jesus, the tradition associated with Hillel, the unnamed fourth philosophy described by Josephus, the repeated designation Jesus the Nazarene, the parallels with the Essenes, and the memories preserved by the early church fathers. We now arrive at the most influential figure in the history of Christianity after Jesus himself, Paul. His letters are the earliest surviving Christian writings composed before the Gospels, with the exception of Mark. They were copied, shared among congregations, and eventually became a cornerstone of the New Testament. Paul also acknowledges something important about his own experience. Unlike Peter, James, John, Mary, and the other apostles, he does not present himself as a companion of Jesus during his public ministry. Instead, he explains that his apostleship began after what he describes as a revelation or vision of the risen Christ. His understanding of Jesus therefore comes not from walking beside him in Galilee, but from what he reported had been revealed afterward. Most Christians have assumed that Jesus and Paul expressed a single understanding of the Torah. Yet readers have long noticed differences in emphasis. Our question is simple. When Jesus and Paul speak about the Torah, do they consistently speak with the same voice? Or do their teachings sometimes reflect the two interpretive traditions we've been exploring, will allow each man to speak in his own words? Paul repeatedly tells his readers that he did not receive his message from those who had walked with Jesus. He never claims to have known Jesus during his earthly ministry. His understanding came through visionary experience, which invites an important historical question. If Jesus taught one thing during his lifetime, and Paul later understood that message differently through revelation, which voice should define Christianity? And which voice does define Christianity? Rather than answering that question, we invite you to compare their words. The author of Acts introduces Paul as a disciple of Gamaliel, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, and zealous for theos, the Greek word that ordinarily translates the Hebrew Elohim. If Gamaliel represents the House of Hillel, Acts places Paul within that tradition. Yet the story takes an unexpected turn. On Cyprus, Paul encounters Bar Jesus, denounces him as son of the devil, and pronounces blindness upon him. If Bar Jesus is understood as son of Jesus, the encounter takes on symbolic significance. Acts appears to portray Paul rejecting the very tradition into which he had been introduced through Gamaliel. According to Josephus, Gamaliel had a son named Jesus. Is that detail merely coincidental, or is the author of Acts inviting readers to recognize another enigma? Paul's letters point in a different direction from the teachings we've examined. Their central focus is no longer the historical teacher who proclaimed mercy, forgiveness, and love of one's enemies, but the risen Christ revealed through Paul's vision, whose sacrificial death becomes the means of salvation. Did the author of Acts preserve this episode as an enigma? If so, the encounter with Bar Jesus is more than an event on Cyprus. It marks a symbolic turning point that may help explain why the teachings of Jesus and those of Paul sometimes appear to speak with different voices. The Greek word for disciple is mathetes, a learner, a student, one who follows a teacher. Its resemblance to the name Matthew raises an intriguing question. Is that similarity merely coincidence, or does the Gospel of Matthew intentionally present itself as the testimony of Gamaliel's disciple Paul after his rejection of Bar Jesus and the tradition he and his father represented? Josephus records that in the years before the destruction of the temple, the office of high priest passed from Jesus son of Gamaliel to Jesus son of Demneus, and then to Matthias. Whether those names preserve a historical transition, a literary tradition, or an enigmatic message remains an open question. That question has guided this investigation from the beginning. I set out in search of the historical Jesus. Instead, the journey uncovered a series of unexpected enigmas. Ish and Isha before Adam and Eve, the tradition of two Torahs, and what may be two visions of Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth and Jesus the Nazarene. If these enigmas preserve a forgotten history, then recovering the face of Jesus requires more than archaeology. It requires learning to read the language, the symbols, and the literary traditions through which history may have been preserved, edited, forgotten, or hidden. The Gospels consistently portray Jesus treating women with unusual dignity. He taught them publicly, welcomed them among his followers, healed them, defended them against public condemnation, praised their faith, and entrusted the first proclamation of his resurrection to women. Nowhere in the recorded teachings of Jesus does he instruct women to remain silent, forbid them to teach, or exclude them from learning. Instead, he repeatedly places compassion above social convention and recognizes women as full participants in the kingdom of God and Goddess. The conflict did not begin in the first century. The Hebrew scriptures preserve an earlier struggle between two competing visions of the divine. On Mount Carmel, the prophet Elijah confronted the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Asherah. After the contest, the biblical account records the execution of the prophets of Baal. It does not record the fate of the prophets of Asherah. If many of those prophets were women, perhaps their tradition did not disappear. The name Asherah may itself preserve an ancient enigma. The consonants SRH can be read as Sarah, Abraham's wife. They may also be read as Isha Ora, woman light. If so, they hint at a tradition centered on compassion rather than sacrifice. Centuries later, the Jerusalem Talmud remembers a violent confrontation in which members of the House of Shammai attacked members of the House of Hillel. The memory of that day was considered so tragic that it was compared to the day Israel made the golden calf. Perhaps these are not isolated stories. Perhaps they are chapters in a much older struggle between sacrifice and compassion, between competing understandings of the divine, and between two visions of the Torah. If so, Jesus the Nazarene did not begin that conflict. He inherited it, and the destruction of the temple did not end it. It simply began its next chapter. Mark's gospel presents a remarkable picture. From beginning to end, women stand among Jesus' most faithful followers. They support his ministry, remain when others flee, witness the crucifixion, prepare his body for burial, and become the first witnesses to the empty tomb. Their role is not incidental, it is central to Mark's story. What if that emphasis reflects more than theology? What if women were also instrumental in preserving and sharing the earliest form of the Jesus tradition? Imagine a community of educated women, perhaps descendants of Cleopatra, working together in Alexandria and Jerusalem, carefully copying scrolls while others prepared to carry those writings wherever the message would be proclaimed. In the first century, every manuscript was copied by hand, one careful line at a time, preserving a tradition intended to be both read and performed. During this same period, Marcus Antonius Pallas, the imperial freedman, rose to extraordinary influence within the Roman Empire. In our research, their story intersects with another possibility, that the annual celebration inspired by Micah's prophecy proclaimed the return of Mother Great and Glorious and Daughter Jerusalem, remembered through the symbolism of bread. In Hebrew, LHM, lahem, is translated bread, and bread carries multiple layers of meaning. Here it represents LHM, Elohim, translated Goddess the Mother, the life-giving source, whose compassion nourishes humanity. Bread was not merely food, it became a living symbol of mercy, wisdom, and restoration. Alexandria was one of the great intellectual centers of the ancient world. There, Philo composed works explaining how sacred writings could preserve deeper meanings through allegory, symbolism, and enigma. If early followers employed similar literary methods, then the Gospel of Mark may have invited thoughtful readers to discover multiple levels of meaning beneath its narrative. These scenes illustrate a compelling possibility that Jesus' message of compassion was preserved not only by teachers who proclaimed it publicly, but also by women whose hands copied the scrolls, whose voices carried the story, and whose generosity distributed both bread and the written word. The message spread because it was lived, shared, copied, and passed from one generation to the next.